All right, welcome everyone. Today, we're diving straight into this explainer, and we are looking at one of the most structurally disruptive geopolitical events in modern economic history. I'm talking about the 2026 Strait of Hormuz closure. Now, this is going to be a fast-paced, high-stakes, data-driven look at exactly how a major geopolitical flashpoint completely paralyzed global material flows, escalated construction costs literally overnight, and forced a massive, radical shift in how the C-suite has to approach supply chain survival. If you really want to grasp the sheer scale of this crisis, just focus on this number for a second: 20 to 30%. That is the massive chunk of the entire world's daily oil consumption that was just suddenly blocked from transit. Add to that 20% of the world's liquefied natural gas. When the Strait of Hormuz closed in the first quarter of 2026, it wasn't just some brief volatility spike in the energy markets. Oh no, it triggered an unprecedented systemic shock. We're talking about an existential threat to mega projects and infrastructure programs all over the globe, but especially within the Gulf Cooperation Council. Okay, let's quickly dive into our roadmap for today. We're going to cover the timeline of the 2026 crisis itself, look at the immediate material shocks, and then compare the resilience of Riyadh versus Doha. After that, we're heading straight into the boardroom to navigate force majeure claims, unpack the future of AI and 3D printing logistics, and wrap up with some absolutely crucial strategies for supply resilience. Let's begin with Section 1, the 2026 Hormuz crisis. We really need to set the geopolitical and operational context here. The sequence of events here was incredibly rapid. Things moved fast. On February 28, 2026, aerial strikes targeted critical facilities in Iran. Just 4 days later, on March 4th, the Strait of Hormuz was officially shut down to all international commercial navigation. Now, what you really have to remember here is that at its narrowest point, this vital maritime corridor is only 21 miles wide. That specific geography meant maritime deterrents were highly effective, just immediately sealing off commercial shipping. By March 28, we started seeing the secondary impacts hit regional infrastructure directly, like the attack on the aluminum Bahrain facility. But here is the truly fascinating part. The very first barrier to entry wasn't actually physical at all. It was financial. Within just 7 days of the blockade, war risk insurance premiums for vessels heading to GCC ports spiked by over 50%. The international insurance market essentially panicked and reacted with extreme risk aversion. So even if a vessel owner was somehow bold enough to risk that 21-mile transit, the complete lack of indemnity coverage made the voyage totally commercially unviable. And that financial blockade leads us directly into Section 2, the immediate shocks and material shortages that paralyzed global supply streams. Now, what's really interesting about this is how clearly it shows the brutal inflationary reality destroying the solvency of fixed-price construction contracts. When historic transshipment hubs like Jebel Ali in Dubai were completely severed from deep-sea routes, the impact was instant. Aluminum shot up an astonishing 39.1% because smelters inside the Gulf suddenly couldn't export their products and, worse, couldn't import the raw materials they needed to keep producing. Steel jumped over 20% due to iron ore pellet exports being interrupted, which completely stalled structural concrete framing. And cement? That rose over 12%, driven heavily by the sudden surge in energy and fuel inflation. But it wasn't just the core raw materials, right? The operational costs went absolutely through the roof. Equipment rental went up as spare parts became scarce, diesel fuel spiked, labor costs increased because, frankly, it became a lot harder to convince international talent to relocate to a high-risk conflict zone. But the most staggering financial penalty by far came from logistics. With the deep-sea maritime routes completely blocked, contractors were desperately forced to rely on emergency air freight just to procure critical mechanical, electrical, and plumbing equipment. This hyper-expensive reliance on air freight triggered a massive 15 to 40% cost increase for those materials alone. So, how did different regions handle this? That brings us to Section 3, our comparative case study. Let's look at Riyadh versus Doha. The divergence between these two is stark. It's like night and day. Riyadh possessed what we call strategic depth. They were able to utilize the Saudi land bridge, which is this massive 1,500-kilometer rail network, along with Red Sea ports, to essentially create a logistics backdoor that bypassed the Strait of Hormuz entirely. Plus, they had highly integrated local content. Doha, on the other hand, faced a literal existential trap. They were operating on an isolated peninsula with a 90% reliance on imported talent and materials, meaning their megaprojects were trapped right at the absolute epicenter of the maritime blockade. And this brilliantly illustrates how geographic redundancy translates directly to your bottom line. If we look at the consolidated contractors' companies' projects in both cities, Riyadh was able to shift its primary route to land and rail. The result? A manageable 18% cost surge and some moderate delays. Doha, locked into that maritime dependency, faced a crushing 40% cost surge, driven entirely by that massive air freight penalty we talked about, right alongside a severe talent gap and just an acute total blockade. Let's zoom in and do a precise risk assessment of Qatar's gas megaprojects for a second, because the situation there was incredibly grim. The massive $8 billion Northfield West project essentially stalled. Huge Asian-manufactured LNG megatrains, which are absolutely crucial for liquefaction, were physically blocked out at sea. On top of that, the project faced a 45,000-worker talent gap because international engineers simply wouldn't travel to the conflict zone. Without any alternative shipping lanes, they were forced into a total execution stoppage, having to pivot from new builds to just basic maintenance. Okay, let's pivot from the physical building sites back to the boardroom. Section 4, Navigating Force Majeure Claims and the Brutal Legal Landscape of Contract Claims. The crucial takeaway here is truly understanding the limits of force majeure. Under FIDIC Article 19, yes, a blockade is a classic force majeure event. But here's the catch, and it's a big one. It typically only grants an extension of time for physical impossibilities. It does not grant you financial compensation for the soaring price escalation of materials and freight. Because of this, executives found themselves legally forced to pivot away from force majeure and had to rely instead on price escalation, hardship, or change in law clauses, just to try and claw back those ballooning air freight and war risk insurance costs. Actually, redrafting and enforcing these contracts meant clearing some very strict legal hurdles. First, you had to pass the foreseeability test. Owners were actively arguing the blockade was foreseeable since tensions had been rising since 2025. Second, you had to prove the blockade was the sole cause of the delay. Third, the duty to mitigate. Were you legally obligated to use the much more expensive Saudi land bridge just to keep the project moving? And fourth, the absolute trapdoor, the 28-day notice of claim. The legal consensus across the board was clear. Missing this tight 28-day window to formally notify owners completely nullified any chance of financial relief, period, no matter how bad the crisis was. Let's move to Section 5 and see how this builds into the future. We're going to look at the proactive technologies like AI and 3D printing that executives absolutely must adopt. Just look at this number, 46.3%. That is staggering. That is the projected compound annual growth rate for the Middle East 3D concrete printing market from 2026 to 2033. And why is that? Because the industrialization of construction is literally the ultimate defense against maritime choke points. During the crisis, Riyadh heavily utilized 3D printing for residential builds and small-scale infrastructure, using 99% locally sourced cementitious materials. By doing this, they managed to cut their construction time by 50% and slash their labor needs by an incredible 80%. It's a real game changer. The crisis also forced a massive technological evolution in logistics. Legacy supply chains that relied on manual tracking, just-in-time inventory, and highly vulnerable single choke points, those are officially obsolete. Moving forward, the baseline standard for large-scale contracts is AI-driven procurement. We're talking about platforms that provide real-time risk prediction, the capability to dynamically reroute shipments from sea to rail instantly based on geopolitical triggers, and a fundamental structural shift toward just-in-case inventory models. Which brings us to our final phase. Section 6, Strategies for Supply Resilience. Let's look at the actionable cure. Based on all the data, here is your high-level strategic blueprint. These 4 steps are pretty much non-negotiable for C-suite leaders now. 1. You absolutely must diversify your suppliers away from dangerous shipping lanes, ensuring at least 30% of critical materials can be multi-sourced via safe transpeninsular land routes. 2. Transition to AI-driven dynamic safety stock. You need to be keeping 6 to 12 months of high-risk materials safely on hand. 3. Protect your bottom line legally. Redraft your future contracts to explicitly include logistics surcharges and war risk clauses. And 4. Maximize off-site 3D printing to keep your supply chain localized and immune to external shocks. The 2026 crisis ultimately proved that ambitious corporate and national visions simply cannot be sustained by fragile 20th century maritime logistics. Logistics is no longer just some back-office function, right? It is a core, strategic pillar of corporate security. So I want to leave you with this final, provocative thought to consider for your own operations. Is your supply chain built for efficiency, or is it built for survival?